Hello and welcome to another podcast of Did Those Feet, the podcast that talks about the golden age of English football from the end of the war, through to England's ejection from the 1970 World Cup and in the summer of 1970. Last week we talked about the avalanche of money that came into the game in the years between 1945 and 1970, and in particular, I suppose we talked about the maximum wage, which was in place to suppress wages and to maintain a certain equality between the clubs, I guess, and the retain and transfer system, which was certainly intended to keep the players in line, I think. And a lot of this was about keeping the players in line. And in that context, we talked about Neil Franklin, a great player who was destroyed by basically, it seems to me, a fairly feudal financial system. Neil Franklin, almost unknown today, but a player of real class and quality, who could easily have gone down in the history of the game, but unfortunately, it is really a footnote. Today, we're going to discuss how the influx of money presented new opportunities for the game in general, and I'm joined as ever by Karl Hemsley. Hello, Karl.
Hello, Peter.
Karl, we thought we'd talk a little bit about rising transfer fees because, if anything, these kind of illustrate. I mean, they're a bit random, but they illustrate how the game got richer over the 25 years that we're focused on. And
Well, that's right. Yeah, you can see the rising transfers of themselves. That's quite interesting, but also some of the stories that are thrown up by each of the record transfers is really quite fascinating. There's more to it than I first thought there might be, than just simply looking at about how much clubs were paying.
I haven't really got a head for figures, but I think we can keep in mind that at the end of the war, the record transfer fee was 15 grand. That was basically more or less. It was 14,500,
That's
and
right. Yeah.
it and then it went to 15,500. So let's say in 1945 we got 15 grand. We'd take it from there, Carl.
Yes. So the first time that the record was broken after the war was by Derby paid 15,500 for Billy Steele, a Scottish inside forward from Morton.
A really fine
Um,
player, by the way. I don't know
yes.
what he was
Now,
doing at
what
Morton,
I
but
find
what a
interesting
player.
about that is he'd played only a handful of games for Morton. So really, the transfer fee, I think, was paid on the strength of his performances in wartime football, which
Right.
I think is interesting of itself.
Mm.
Um, I think there's a bit of a feisty character and apparently not well liked in the Derby dressing room. And
Mm.
that part of the reason for that, and this ties in with money, is that he was paid roughly the same amount of money for a newspaper column that he was for playing football. And that didn't go down terribly well with his teammates,
Interesting.
um, which I thought that was an interesting thing about money. Um, the next time it was broken was within a couple of months. One of the most surprising and fascinating of transfers when Tommy Lawton was transferred for £20,000. He went from Chelsea to Notts County, who were in the third division. And I was trying to think what the equivalent would be today. And ludicrous as it sounds, it seems to me that it would be Harry Kane going to Northampton Town. It's it,
Absolutely. You're
it's
right in
as
a
mad
way.
as that. Because
Lawton was an elite centre forward. You're absolutely right.
well, this is it. If you count wartime football, he played about as many wartime internationals as he did, if you like, official internationals. Lawton got 46 goals in 46 games.
Yeah.
Matthew said he's the best header of the ball that he ever played with.
Yeah.
Lawton was an absolute star, and he went down two divisions, which I think shows that they just financially there wasn't the difference that there is now between the divisions.
No, that's right.
Nothing approaching.
No.
And part of the reason he went to Notts County was that the chairman had promised him a job after he'd finished playing, which again just shows how relatively little players were paid, certainly compared to today. they were paid better than your working man, but on average, but not by enormous amounts.
No, but
So
I'd say
that,
but they may have got about double, something like double. I mean, I think
yeah,
the average wage around about 1950 was about £8, and I think what was the maximum wage was 14, wasn't it, about that time? Let's go to 1950 and the transfer of Trevor Ford, because Trevor Ford, a Welsh striker from going from Aston Villa to Sunderland for 30 grand. And so that gives us something to pin our analysis on, because we've got in 5 years now, so from the end of the war to 1950, the record transfer fee has doubled from 15 to 30. How do you know? Is that
well, again, it's one of the interesting transfers because Sunderland were known around that time as a Bank of England club. Um, a couple of years earlier, they'd broken the transfer fee when they bought Len Shackleton. Ford is an interesting one because he ended up getting a ban from playing in England for a while. He went over and played in the Netherlands, and this was because he seemed to be a whistleblower of sorts because he talked about Sunderland giving illegal payments,
how
which
interesting?
again it was as a way of getting round the issue of the maximum wage.
Interesting. I knew he didn't get on with Shackleton. Shackleton was the big fish
Not at
at
all. Not
Sunderland.
at all.
I mean, that's why he
Yeah.
left in the end, isn't it?
Yes. And I mean, Shackleton apparently almost he managed to get a benefits match out of the club by threatening uh, to reveal these illegal payments. Ford actually did
Wow.
that.
Wow.
Shackleton had a job selling as a car salesman for the chairman, for instance.
Yeah.
Whereas Ford talked about the houses and the kitchens that the club would give. So again, it's all obviously because of money, because they couldn't just straightforwardly pay what the players
No, I
were
mean, you've got to
worth to them.
question, when somebody like Ford, who's an international player, he's got a good international career, he's moving from Villa to Sunderland, you've got to question, why is he moving? I mean, presumably it's not because he prefers to have the maximum wage paid by Sunderland rather than to have the maximum wage paid by Villa. This is the trouble when you have a maximum wage. I think the rugby found the same thing in England,
Absolutely.
that you get people trying to find their way around it. The transfers rise quite slowly in the 1950s, don't they? Extraordinary until
Yeah. There was so not long after Ford, Jackie Sewell brought the transfer fee 34,500. Then it's interesting that lasted for about 4 years, and then there were consecutive breakings of the record by players being bought by Italian clubs,
exactly.
which
I mean,
again
this
is
is
interesting
you,
because it shows how much more money was
yeah.
there in Italy than in England.
This is what breaks the transfer system wide open in that phrase. That in the mid 50s, when the transfer system is fairly benign in England, not much is happening, and in terms of at least in terms of acceleration, all of a sudden, in come the Italians with pots of money. I suspect it's individual Italians, isn't it? It'll be people like the owner of Ferrari or
Yeah,
that
no,
sort
because
of.
funny enough, it was different clubs. So Sampdoria, they only upped the record very slightly when they bought Eddie Firmini, who was a South African but with Italian ancestry. They got him from Charlton. But the big one was in 1957 when John Charles went for 65,000. So the record jumped by 30,000, and
Yes,
he went to
it doubles.
Juventus.
It doubles
Yes,
effectively, and
pretty much.
and
Yeah.
it's gone up by 4 times since the war. So that's we're talking now about in the 10 years since the war, it's gone up 4 times by 4 times.
Yeah. And John Charles, I mean, I think there could almost be a podcast on him alone. A good case for him being the most successful export there's ever been. Then it was Jerry Hitchens. Inter bought him for 85,000, and then Dennis Law, who didn't have a great time in Italy because he didn't like it very much. But by now we've gone past 100,000.
Yes, exactly.
So um, so Torino, paid, I think it was about 110,000, and then just a year later, Manchester United paid slightly more, I think it's 115,000 to bring him back. So now we've had in the early 60s we're getting a big jump, and then it kind of
Well, I just
not,
wondered, just
not
at that point, Carl, just float a theory past you, which is that we've got in the late 50s Italian clubs and maybe industrialists as well coming in and interfering in the British or the English transfer system, and influencing it. And I just wonder, because they're picking up, I mean, they're coming here looking for one particular type of player, and that is sharp, goal scoring, finishers, sniffers, if you like. People like
yeah,
Jimmy Greaves and Dennis Law. These are real, highly attractive players from the point of view of, and the British game is diminished by losing them, or the English game is diminished by losing them. And I wonder if because obviously these players went abroad. Jimmy Greaves is quite explicit. He goes abroad because there's more money there. He can get away from the maximum wage. And I just wonder how much the influx of Italian money in the mid 50s, late 50s, influenced the abolition of the maximum wage. In other words, the league could see what was happening, that they were going to
yeah,
have to compete on a European basis now. It wasn't any longer that they could control it on their own. And they just simply capitulated because the alternatives were too horrible to think about, which was that they were going to lose all their best players to Italy or Spain or elsewhere. And so I just wonder, I've never seen this written down, but I think that the Italians had a big influence on the abolition of the maximum wage.
yeah. I think that is an interesting one, Peter, because I'd always thought of it as being the football clubs being dragged through the courts, or the threat of courts, kicking and screaming. But I think you might be right. I think it might be more complicated than that, and the
Well, I think they
clubs
suddenly capitulated.
realizing the way that, like you said, what the result would be.
Yeah,
That
yeah.
England would very much be a second-rate power, as it were, if the best players were all going off elsewhere.
Now, do my quick mental arithmetic. I reckon that if we say that the average big transfer or the kind of representative big transfer in 1960 is 100 grand, then I would say that since 1950, in the 10 years, in other words, the 1950s, between 1950 and 1960, record transfers went up by a factor of three, roughly, from about 30,000 to about 100,000. And
Yeah, and
so that's quite a
the
considerable. We think of the 50s as being quite austere, quite short of money. That's quite an amazing rise.
it is, isn't it? And whereas in the 60s, the rise wasn't
No, it's
as
more
dramatic.
modest. No, it's more modest.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah, because it took, about 6 years after Law, it was Chivers broke the record. The record was broke for Tottenham buying Chivers from Southampton, but it was only 10 grand more,
Yeah,
125,000.
yeah, yeah.
And then by Alan Clark moved twice, each time broke the record. And then there was a bit of a jump. So at the end of our period, when Martin Peters moved as the first £200,000 player,
Yeah,
when he went from West Ham to Spurs.
yeah.
So it
So
sort of,
actually, curiously enough, the transfer fee goes up. The record transfer fee goes up by three times in the 50s and by twice in the 60s. So really the opposite of what I would expect. I would have thought that the 60s was a period of where the money was flying around. But no, it's a period it was not. It's not quite
I
as
mean,
simple as that.
is that because they weren't paying the money in salaries in the 50s and therefore paid it in transfer fees?
That is
Whereas
exactly what I think, Carl.
Whereas in the 60s, it was they could attract players by offering the the biggest salaries.
It's exactly what I think. I think that in the 50s, the clubs were making so much money that they could afford to because they weren't paying their players properly. I think more money went to the players after 1960, less on transfers, more for the players.
And I suppose the other thing was did the end of the retain and transfer system act as something of a break on the size of fees? Because when you had retain and transfer, the club was absolutely in charge. If I'm the chairman and you're the player,
Yeah,
and I say, Smith, you're going nowhere, then
yeah.
you're going nowhere. And the only way for a club to get you, and an alternative club to get you, is by offering my club enough money that I want to sell. But the retain and transfer system going meant that players had more of a say
Well,
in their own fate,
that's
and
undoubtedly,
so
yes. Yes, that's
yeah,
undoubtedly the case. Yes.
and I think so. The retain and transfer system in terms of money, I think, was very important. And just as a for instance, I enjoyed reading the story of uh, a record transfer fee in the 40s when Johnny Morris went from Manchester United to Derby. Matt Busby was insistent that he wouldn't sell him. And the way Morris was able to engineer the move was by saying he was going to pack football in and become a professional golfer.
Yes.
And apparently he was good enough at golf and other sports as well, apparently. But he was an all-round sportsman. But Manchester United were concerned enough that this wasn't a bluff that they accepted payment from Derby, and he moved there. Whereas once the retain and transfer system went with the George Easton court case in '63, then that was it was easier for players to get the moves they wanted.
Oh, I think that's probably right. I mean, I think certainly that was the end of the retaining transfer system, freed the players up to negotiate like anybody else. And it seems to me that one of the, like anybody else, like if you're a teacher or whatever other profession you got, that you can apply for the jobs you want to apply for at the salaries you want, you can negotiate. And um, that was what getting rid of the retaining transfer system enabled the players to do. And so I think it was just really was a matter of football catching up with society. It was its own little bubble, its own little cocoon. And in the 60s, it had to appreciate that society was changing and people's rights, were changing and so forth. Now, one of the things that really did differ between the 50s and the 60s, I think, is the disappearance of amateurism from the game. Now, that sounds
Yes.
extraordinary to people who are not familiar with the football of the 1950s, but the plain fact is that in the 1950s, there was still quite a collection of amateur footballers playing. There's examples of players who are still in the top. Now, bear in mind that amateurism was quite an important factor in society in general, in sports in general, I should say.
Mm.
Wimbledon was entirely amateur. The Olympics were,
Yes.
of course, entirely amateur. The England cricket captain was expected to be amateur for convoluted reasons to, 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 to too unbelievable to go into. Rugby union was entirely amateur. That is to say that big international rugby players had other jobs. They would go to their work as an accountant or bricklayer on the following Monday. And so amateurism was quite important in sport in general. But nevertheless, it is still a surprise. It seems to me that football fought this battle back in the 1880s. It's a surprise to find that there are still amateur players at the top level of the game. We've got people who are, for example, playing in an FA Cup final. Bill Slater for Blackpool in the 1951 FA Cup final is an amateur and goes into work presumably on the following Monday. George Robb plays for England against Hungary famously in 1953. He's an
Right.
amateur. He's a school teacher. He goes into work on the following on the day, the day after, the Thursday after.
Hmm.
It's an extraordinary period. There's one of Chelsea's strikers in when they win the league in 55. Is it 55, 56? Jim Lewis is an amateur. He can make more money. He's a thermos flask salesman. He can make more money as a thermos flask salesman. He plays for Chelsea regularly, routinely, but
Yeah.
his actual job, he had a car. He was a traveling salesman. He had to pay for all this. Well, he could make more money from selling thermos flasks than from playing football. It's an extraordinary collection of really quite high-powered players who are not getting paid at all for the work they're doing as employees of their football clubs.
Mm. It is absolutely extraordinary. Yeah, the idea of somebody now playing as an amateur in the Premier League, it would just be a non-starter, wouldn't it?
Well, I think
Um,
the average football league, the average Premier League player is on about £5 million a year, I reckon, the
mm,
average regular. So he'd be giving up a lot of money.
that's right. Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Of course, we ought to mention that because we're talking about money, so amateurism is in a way the other side of the coin, if I can use that phrase. That
Mm.
that amateur football in England is very, powerful, very successful, very is flourishing in the 50s. Amateur internationals um, are filmed on TV, are put on TV. The Amateur
Yeah.
Cup final commands audiences of 100,000. It's a
Yes.
big talking point.
Yes. So much bigger a thing than it is now. Uh, yeah, the annual final at Wembley was a massive deal. Like you say, sometimes shown on TV, and yeah, it would be as packed out as the FA Cup final.
Now, it might be unfair of me to contrast amateur footballers with those who took part in the betting scandal, another feature of the way that money impacted on football in the 50s and 60s. But in a way, what happened in 1964 when the betting scandal is exposed is the other side of the coin, it seems to me,
Yeah.
from amateurism and the amateur ideal. And I don't know how we feel about this, but let's go with the facts first of all. Um, we've got three first division footballers nailed for betting offences, betting against their own team. Tell us the background of this, Karl.
Yeah, so the fixer seemed to have been a fairly recently retired, probably fair to say, journeyman footballer, Jimmy Gold. But he got three players who played for Sheffield Wednesday: Peter Swan, Tony Kay, and David Lane, universally called Bronco Lane, and paid them to throw a match. So Sheffield Wednesday, they played for, lost 2-0 to Ipswich. Now, years later, Swan, who was a centre half, he played 19 times for England, he swore blind that actually the game was won fair and square by Ipswich. Nevertheless, he'd taken the money. And what would have happened if Wednesday had done better? Would he have thrown the game? Well, presumably he would have done. The other two players, Bronco Lane was a centre forward, and he had a very successful career, good goal scoring record. And Tony Kay was a halfback who, not long after this match where he was involved in throwing the game, he moved to Everton. Incidentally, there was an idea that Tony Kay was the best player on the pitch in the game when
He's man of the match, apparently, man of
yeah,
the
yeah,
match.
when Wednesday lost to Ipswich. Not long later, he followed his Sheffield Wednesday manager, Harry Catterick, to Everton.
That's right.
Became
Catterick knew him
there,
very well.
helped them to win the league. And interestingly, he only had one England cap, but I think it's a very, very good chance that he could have established himself as
I think
England
two of them could have done. I think
as
Swan could
Charles.
have done. I think
Swan, Swan,
Swan
yeah,
has
Swan was
90.
still
Swan is a
very much
centre
in
back.
contention.
He's a centre back with 19 caps. He on the day that England won the World Cup in whenever it was, July 1966, Peter Swan must have been beside himself with misery because he had absolutely ruined his life for 50 quid. He could have been, I think he could have been the centre back, the centre half that Jack Charlton. Bear in mind, Jack Charlton didn't get his first cap until 65. So Swan
Yeah,
has got
yeah,
19 and would have been the centre back in 62, actually, in the World Cup in 62, except that he was ill.
yeah,
He had I think two of them had a tremendous career. And,
yeah. And
and
Kay, I mean, you say about Jack Charlton didn't establish himself until not very long before the World Cup. Of course, the same's true of Nobby Stiles.
indeed, absolutely.
And Kay, Styles played in the position that Kay
Yes,
would have done.
yes.
And much as Ramsey came to love Styles, and Styles obviously did a massively effective job for England, I think it's fair to say that Kay had a much better all-round game than Styles did.
He might well have done.
Yeah,
Mind you, having said that, Ramsey was very clear with his players. He said, "This is your job, and this is what I want you to do. Here's the job
yeah,
description." So it wasn't an all-round game so much. Styles was given a particular job: win the ball and give it to Bobby. So we don't know,
mm,
but no. It's such a. I mean, two of them, I think for sure. really did throw away, and they bitterly regretted it. They won
Because
50, if I'm not
I mean,
mistaken.
their careers
Their careers were toast.
were good. Yeah, I mean, Swan and Lane both did make comebacks many years later, but really, it was just the tail end of uh, what would have been just the tail end of the careers, really. And and Lane, sorry, and Kay really was finished. They all had lifetime bans that eventually got overturned, but of course, a footballer can only last so long. And when the bans were overturned,
I
it was
think
too
rightly
late.
so. I think they were rightly punished, because
Oh
it's.
yeah,
I
yeah,
mean,
yeah,
if you're deceiving 30,000 people, crowd of 30,000 people, that's quite a
yeah,
crime. I think all of whom have paid their hard-earned. I don't think they had anything to complain about, but they could
yeah.
at least lament their rotten luck. And I think it's probably to do with. I mean, again, society intrudes, doesn't it? The Gambling Act of 1960 legalizes gambling. There are bound to be tests of the act. There are bound to be people who are pushing the boundaries. This was a case in professional sport where that happened. And maybe without the Gambling Act, none of this would have happened. But there it did. And so there was only the sort of the legal side to finish. Now, these years we're discussing they seem very long ago and far away, but at the same time they were years of great innovation and a lot of different things, a lot of different factors in society and in the game brought a lot of money into the game. And among those things, we've got a proliferation of new tournaments, of new trophies, which brought more money into the game. The European Cup, for example, and the League Cup, which was inaugurated in 1960, with the sense that it would make up for clubs who were paying in Europe. Well, then the rest can take part in the League Cup, and new media, of course, to record these things, like TV, obviously, and new technologies like floodlighting. So take us through this, Carl. What these new competitions and these new opportunities, how much did they change the game, and how much money did they start to bring into the game? What was their impact?
Well, I mean, Europe. I mean, at first there was great reluctance to take part, and famously Chelsea uh, were the first English team who qualified to play for the European Cup because they were the English champions in the first season, but they didn't take part. So Manchester United were the first to take part,
Osby saw
and
this first, didn't he?
yes, and and that and that grew, and I think there was of course the great Real Madrid side that won the first five of those competitions, and I think it's fair to say that that was a side that captured people's imagination in this country and in others. And there wasn't much televised of the European Cup in this country, but there was some games were shown. It seemed quite random which ones they would be, and sometimes it might be just a second half. But that definitely increased, and it got to an increase in the interest in the competition. I'm not sure how much money was made initially. It seems to me it's sort of a sowing of the seed for fortunes being made later. The League Cup, I don't think I'd fully grasped really that it was it kind of in reaction to Europe. That it was an attempt to say other clubs can benefit from playing in an extra competition. And of course, the other thing that made it possible was having floodlights, which I mean, immediately after the war, clubs didn't really have them. I mean, apparently the first floodlight match was in the late 19th century, but that was kind of an experiment. It didn't take off, and it was really in the sort of the mid 50s when it really started. Only the odd club had them, but Wolves, for example, had floodlights, which allowed them to play the famous game against Honved. Initially, Manchester United, for example, didn't have floodlights. So when they started playing in Europe, they had to use Main Road because Man City did have lights. So the first handful of games that United played at home in Europe were played across the city. So floodlights were a new technology. And the other, of course, really interesting technology is TV, which there had been a couple of live games showed on TV before the war in 1938. There was an England-Scotland game and an FA Cup final. But there's an estimate, there were only about 10,000 TV sets around at the time. And then after the war, there was for example, there was a fifth round cup tie between Charlton and Blackburn that was shown live. But interestingly, for the first few years after the war, for technical reasons, only games in London could be broadcast live, which I hadn't realised.
No, I didn't know that.
Yeah. But the relationship was always between the footballing authorities and TV was always very strange. For example, in October of 1947, there was a game between Charlton and Chelsea that was to be broadcast live, but the Football League stepped in to stop it. Again, something I hadn't realised, but from 1955 to 1963, Saturday nights, they were brief, as in 5 minutes, highlights shown of games on a program called Sports Special.
I didn't know that.
No, I'd no idea about that until I was reading around it. There was an early attempt at live league football in the 60-61 season. So ITV agreed a deal worth 150,000 with the Football League. And the idea was they were going to screen 26 matches. But again, it was so kind of ramshackle. So there was a game, the first game was between Blackpool and Bolton. It kicked off at 10-7, but the live coverage didn't start till 7:30. I think that was to do with waiting until people had got home from matches that they'd seen live.
That probably was.
But then it fell through because ITV withdrew because first Arsenal and then Tottenham refused permission to broadcast matches that they had at home, and so this fell down.
You can understand why in these early days, before they've got the whole picture quite kind of clearly mapped out in their own heads, that the first instinct of clubs with potential attendances of sort of 50, 60, 70,000 is if we put it on the TV, nobody's going to turn up. You can quite understand why that would be. And so eventually, it's not until 1964, isn't it, with BBC Two and Match of the Day and Kenneth Wolstenholme and Arsenal versus Liverpool, if I remember correctly. And the dam begins to give a little bit. And of course, it's not until Sky, really. It's 1990, so we're talking 50 years is really it takes.
It did take a long time.
And for football terms with TV. And actually, I think football is quite a reactionary sport. It's quite frightened of the future. Lots of the stories we've been telling here have been about football trying to resist new technologies or new innovations coming into the game. And, I think the same was absolutely true of television. Now I think they've probably just about got the thing right. I don't know, but there's a good balance there with the stadiums are full and the TV is still showing it live. It's working that way, but it's taken an awful long time.
I hadn't realised again how experimental Match of the Day was. That when it went out in 1964, it was on BBC Two, which could only be picked up in London.
That's
so
right.
that famous highlights of that first game between Liverpool and Arsenal, there were far more people in Anfield than were able to watch the highlight on TV.
True.
And again, I hadn't realised the extent to which it was kind of an experiment in preparation for the World Cup.
Of course it was. Yes, that's right enough.
The televising of the World Cup, because up until then they were very brief clips. I think it's fair to say from the 1950 World Cup, and then the World Cups from 54, 58, and 62. There were some of those games were shown, but for example, in 62, because it was played in Chile, the games were watched here 2 or 3 days after they'd been played.
Yes, they'd take the film, get an aeroplane, put the film on the aeroplane,
Yeah.
flight,
Come,
flight, flight back to
flight from the
London.
states, flight from the states over here. There were live games in '54 and '58, but not, by no means all the matches. It was just a few. So really, '66 was you might say the first World Cup to be shown on television properly, in this country.
Now, Karl,
Um,
we're coming towards the end of our time,
yeah,
so let me just thrill you with a little anecdote, which I think also points the way to where the game is going at the end of the 1960s. And I'm saying this to you both as a Manchester United fan, as you are, and
yeah,
as on the day that Dennis Law was buried.
yes.
That this is also the beginning, the very, very vague beginnings of sponsorship. Sponsorship is beginning
Ah,
to come into football in these years, and I actually was there at the very birth of it myself, incredibly enough. And really, what happens with sponsorship is that by the end of the 70s, um, names of companies are beginning to appear on football shirts, and by the 80s, competitions are beginning. We got the Milk Cup and Littlewood Cup.
mm,
Companies are beginning to sponsor trophies and tournaments. And of course, that's now absolutely rampant and rife. Half the Premiership teams are sponsored by betting companies, ironically enough,
yeah,
and so forth. But sponsorship really begins, I think, in football. The earliest I can find is the summer of 1970 with a competition called the Watney's Cup. And the
what
Watney
we
Cup, Watney
yes,
was a beer, and the Watney Cup
yes,
was intended for the top scorers of each of the four divisions, so the top two
right,
teams of each of the four divisions. And in 1970, so 69, 70, the top scorers in the first division were Manchester United, and in the
yes,
third division were my local team, Reading. And as it happened, in the
right,
Watney Cup, so you've got 8 teams, so it's a round of eight. In the Watney Cup, Manchester United were drawn to go and play at Reading. And this was August the 1st, 1970. I remember it well. I'll never forget the date because that was the day when, along with 18,000 other Reading fans, I stood on the terraces to watch Bobby Charlton, Dennis Law, George Best, Nobby Stiles, and all those other heroes. We never saw anything like that at Reading. We used to get Mansfield and Scunthorpe. Uh, eh, well, extraordinary. And
yeah,
needless to say, Manchester United won by a suitably fruitful game, three goals to two, with plenty of action and excitement. And but as it happened, I mean, we never knew it at the time, but that really was the beginnings of
yeah,
sponsorship in in the beautiful game. And so what we've done here is we've had a look at lots of different. There's no single line to draw from this, I don't think, except perhaps that football got rich. Football got rich because people with money found it attractive and interesting to get involved in, like the Watney Cup, and but money just would not keep out of football. I think perhaps in the years up until the war, money had kept its distance. Well, that all changed after 1945, as we've seen. So there we are, Karl. We're done again, and
thank you, Peter.
next time we shall be back with a discussion of managers in the 1950s. And no, thank you, Karl, and see you. See you soon.